You guys just keep asking for the more Reddit stories. So, I'm ready with the new tale. Let's read some cool, interesting cheating wife Reddit stories. And guys, I'm trying to hit 1,000 subs before the end of the year, and I think we can do it. So please subscribe and let's get straight into this one. I came home early from work and found my wife cheating with my stepfather. I thought I knew my wife. After all, we'd been together for 5 years, and in that time, I thought I'd come to understand every little quirk, every small habit that made her the woman I loved. Emily was the kind of wife every man dreams of, beautiful, intelligent, and supportive, always ready with a smile or a joke that would light up my darkest days. She knew how to keep things exciting, and she often surprised me in ways that kept our relationship feeling fresh, even after several years of marriage. She was my rock, and I never thought I'd ever question her loyalty. Emily had that irresistible charm, the kind that could captivate an entire room. When we were out together, it was impossible to miss the way people were drawn to her, the way they'd lean in, hanging on her every word. She had that perfect mix of sophistication and warmth that made her magnetic. To be honest, I always felt a bit lucky to have her as my wife. Maybe a bit too lucky, but I never wanted to let insecurity poison the relationship. My work as a construction project manager had me working long hours, often late into the night. Emily always made sure to be there when I got home, a warm smile on her face and dinner ready. It felt perfect, too perfect, maybe, but again, I didn't dwell on it. In the back of my mind, I felt that Emily was the kind of wife you could trust implicitly. I was sure she'd be loyal, no matter what. But life has a strange way of proving you wrong when you least expect it. Looking back, I guess there were signs, little red flags that I ignored. There were times she'd leave her phone face down on the table, or how she'd excuse herself to catch up with old friends over coffee, looking extra polished every time. She brushed it off as nothing more than reconnecting with people she hadn't seen in years. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to her social nature. I never wanted to be that guy, the husband who suspects his wife of every little thing. Then came that fateful Friday. I'd planned to work late into the evening, but the project had hit a snag, and I found myself heading home around noon. I thought it would be a nice surprise. I imagined her face lighting up when I walked through the door, maybe catching her in the middle of whatever she did while I was out. That day, I wanted nothing more than to come home early, kick back with Emily, and start our weekend on a high note. But the moment I walked through the door, something felt off. The house was unusually quiet. Normally, I'd hear music from the living room or the faint sound of her moving around in the kitchen. But this time, there was nothing. My gut told me something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling, even as I set down my briefcase and started toward the staircase. I reached the bottom of the stairs when I heard voices. Soft, intimate whispers coming from the bedroom, accompanied by a laugh that sounded hauntingly familiar. I froze, listening. My mind spun with possible explanations, each one more absurd than the last. Maybe she was on the phone? But the voices were too clear, too close. The laughter I'd heard was distinctly hers, yet it carried a tone I hadn't heard before. My heart pounded, and an uncomfortable heat crept up my neck. I crept up the stairs, each step feeling like it would give me away. I didn't know what I'd find, and part of me didn't want to know. But I was driven by something deeper, an instinct I couldn't ignore. As I neared our bedroom door, I heard another voice, lower, more commanding. I knew that voice. It was unmistakable. It was my stepfather, Robert. My blood turned cold, disbelief momentarily freezing me in place. My stepfather was nearly 20 years older than me, a man I'd always admired, who had stepped in after my father passed away. He'd been there for me, supported me, and in many ways had shaped the man I'd become. The idea of him being in my bedroom with my wife was something I couldn't even comprehend. And yet, here I was, standing outside, hearing the two of them talk in tones that sent a chill through my entire body. It was then that I heard her giggle, followed by a soft, breathy whisper. "You should have come over sooner." I felt paralyzed outside the door, my hand shaking as it hovered over the doorknob. A wave of nausea rolled over me, and I had to swallow hard to keep myself steady. My mind raced, desperate for some explanation that wouldn't destroy me. My stepfather was here, with my wife in our bedroom. It made no sense, yet the unmistakable sounds from inside only made one explanation possible. I couldn't ignore it. I gripped the doorknob and turned it, barely registering the sound of the latch clicking as the door swung open. There, on our bed, tangled in sheets, was the woman I had once believed was everything to me. My wife, Emily. And beside her, impossibly close, was Robert, my stepfather, looking stunned and entirely out of place. For a split second, the room fell silent. Emily's face was frozen in shock, her wide eyes locked onto mine. She gasped, pulling the sheet up to cover herself, while Robert scrambled, his face twisted in an odd mixture of shame and defiance. His gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw something that I'd never associated with him before, a glint of arrogance. "Mike, I thought you weren't coming home until later," Emily stammered, her voice shaky but too composed for the situation. A part of me wanted to laugh, though nothing about this felt remotely funny. I'd never once imagined that my wife, my Emily, would have the nerve to justify this, much less in such a pitiful, casual way. And Robert, standing there beside her, didn't even seem surprised. It was as if he'd rehearsed this moment in his mind. He didn't try to explain himself. He just gave me a look, one that almost dared me to respond. There was no trace of the fatherly figure I'd once looked up to. "Explain yourself," I managed, my voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. Emily pulled the sheet tighter around herself, but she didn't even flinch. Instead, she let out a long, dramatic sigh, as if this was some trivial inconvenience she'd have to deal with. "This isn't what you think," she said, glancing at Robert before looking back at me. "It's just complicated. Complicated." As if the wreckage of my marriage, the betrayal of my family, could be summed up by such a feeble word. Her face held an expression I couldn't quite read, but something inside me snapped. In one step, I closed the distance between us, and she backed up, raising her hands as if to ward off any physical blow. "I don't think there's much left to say," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I turned to Robert, who had now found his clothes and was hurriedly pulling them on. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "Save it," I spat. "Get out of my house, and don't ever come back." He hesitated for a moment, and I thought he might try to argue. But, as if deciding against it, he finally slinked out of the bedroom, leaving me alone with Emily. The moment he was gone, Emily looked at me, a strange look of defiance in her eyes. "Mike, don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from her before. There was something dark and dismissive in her eyes, as if I were the one making this whole scene dramatic. "You've been so wrapped up in your work, always putting your job first. You've been distant, and I needed someone. Robert was there for me in a way you haven't been." Her words hit me like a blow. It was surreal. The woman who I had loved, who I had supported, was standing there justifying herself, blaming me. I took a step back, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts in my mind. I knew that if I let my rage loose now, I'd say things that I couldn't take back. But she didn't stop. "You don't understand, Mike. This isn't about you. It's about me, about us," she continued, her words spilling out as if she'd rehearsed them. "Robert listens to me. He appreciates me. You don't get it, do you? You've been so focused on work, always coming home exhausted. You never even see me anymore." Something inside me shattered. Her words were twisting the knife, each sentence designed to make me feel smaller, more at fault. Emily, my Emily, had become a stranger right in front of my eyes. "Get out," I said, my voice low and cold. I didn't recognize the person I'd become in that moment, but I knew that whatever feeling I'd once had for her was dead. "Take your things and get out of my house." Her face twisted into something ugly, and she let out a scornful laugh. "You're serious? You're going to throw me out over one mistake?" "One mistake?" I echoed, my voice cold. "Emily, this isn't a mistake. This is a choice. You chose to betray me with my own stepfather. You don't get to stand here and act like I owe you forgiveness." For a moment, she faltered. I saw a flicker of doubt cross her face, a crack in that mask of defiance. but it was gone as quickly as it had come, replaced by a look of pure contempt. "You know what, Mike?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Fine, I'll leave. But don't think for a second that you're the victim here. I've been lonely for months, waiting for you to notice me. If you had been any kind of husband, this never would have happened." Her words left me breathless, but I was done. I couldn't listen to her try to justify this, to paint herself as the victim. I turned my back, walked to the door, and waited in silence as she gathered her things. I heard the sound of her suitcase wheels on the hardwood floor, her footsteps echoing down the stairs. She didn't say goodbye, and I didn't look back. A few minutes later, I heard the door slam, and silence fell over the house. But even with her gone, the betrayal lingered. I stood alone in the wreckage of the life I thought I knew, realizing for the first time just how little I had understood about the woman I'd married. I felt my blood pounding with a newfound determination. This wasn't over. In the quiet aftermath, a dark thought took root. Emily had hurt me in a way that I could never forgive, but that didn't mean I was powerless. No, I'd find a way to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had inflicted on me. That night was endless. I barely slept, pacing the house like a ghost, my mind replaying every memory, every word, every moment between us, tainted now by I'd loved her, trusted her, even defended her to others who claimed she was too good to be true. And now, the evidence was burned into my mind, each piece of her betrayal sharper than the last. I wondered how long it had been going on, how many lies she'd told me to keep me in the dark, all while sneaking around with the man I had once called family. The humiliation was almost unbearable. I'd been too trusting, too confident in what we had, too blinded by love to see the signs right in front of me. Emily had always been good at keeping secrets, though. I thought back to times she'd been out late or come home distracted, and how I dismissed it as work stress, as her need for space. Now, I realized she'd been clever, manipulating my trust, knowing I'd believe her. Every time I saw her smile or caught her gaze from across the room, I thought I was looking into the eyes of the woman I loved. But now, all I saw were layers of deception. The next morning, I had no appetite, no energy for anything except revenge. I wanted her to feel the sting of betrayal, the burn of humiliation, just as I had. But I knew Emily well enough to know that simply cutting her out of my life wouldn't be enough. She was cunning, calculating, and would likely move on with ease unless I found a way to get inside her head, to hurt her in a way that would leave a scar. That's when a dark, twisted idea came to me. Emily had a younger sister, Sarah, a sweet, innocent girl who had always looked up to me. Sarah was everything Emily was not: genuine, kind, and fiercely loyal. Emily and Sarah had never gotten along, and I'd always been caught in the middle of their spats. Emily would complain that her sister was too clingy, too needy, or too naive to understand the real world. But Sarah had been like a younger sibling to me. I had always watched out for her, especially when Emily's cruelty got the best of her. If there was anyone who could shake Emily's world, it was Sarah. The thought twisted inside me, sinister but alluring. Sarah was innocent in all this. I knew that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized she might be the key to my revenge. If Emily thought she could hurt me and walk away, she was dead wrong. I would give her something she'd never see coming, something that would haunt her for a long, long time. I hadn't seen Sarah since the last family gathering. I remembered how she looked at me that day, her smile bright as she asked me about work, about my life, genuinely interested in what I had to say. Emily had always sneered at those moments, probably sensing the way Sarah gravitated toward me. I couldn't deny it. Sarah was beautiful, with a softness that Emily had long since lost. I took a deep breath, feeling my resolve solidify. This plan, as twisted as it was, felt like the only way to make Emily understand the depths of the pain she'd inflicted on me. If I were going to do this, I'd have to approach it carefully. I needed Sarah to believe my intentions were genuine, that I wasn't simply luring her into something she'd regret. I couldn't afford to make a misstep. This would have to be played with subtlety and patience. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found her number. I hadn't messaged Sarah in a while, but that didn't stop me from typing out a casual text. I told her I'd been thinking about her, that I hoped she was doing well. I even threw in a mention of how much I'd always valued her kindness and how I appreciated our conversations. Then I added the hook, just a small one, that things had been rough between me and her sister lately and that I could use someone to talk to. I hit send, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt. A few moments later, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah, and she responded almost instantly. "Hey, Mike. It's been a while. I'm sorry things have been hard for you. Emily can be tough to deal with, I know. Let me know if you want to grab coffee or something. We can talk anytime." Her warmth came through in the text, and it made my stomach twist with guilt. But I pushed it down. This was part of the plan. Sarah didn't know the truth of her sister's betrayal, and she didn't need to. I responded, arranging to meet her for coffee that weekend. A part of me felt sick with the thought of using her, of turning someone so innocent into a pawn in my game of revenge. But the darker, angrier part of me relished the plan, eager to see it unfold. I would give Emily a taste of what betrayal felt like, even if it meant dragging her own family into it. The rest of the week crawled by slowly, each day bringing a new surge of anger and bitterness. I avoided any calls from Emily, blocking her number and letting her messages pile up, unread. She hadn't expected me to go silent. She probably thought she'd broken me, that I'd beg her to come back. I wanted her to wonder, to sit in the silence of her own making, feeling the consequences of her actions ripple back toward her. When the weekend finally arrived, I met Sarah at a small, cozy coffee shop in the city. She looked happy to see me, her face lighting up as she waved me over to her table. I forced a smile, keeping my expression soft and casual as I joined her. She asked me how I was doing, her eyes warm and concerned, and for a brief moment, I almost forgot about my plan. But the memory of Emily's laughter, her words, and her cold explanation came rushing back, hardening my resolve. I started off slowly, telling Sarah about the problems I'd been having with Emily, how things had felt wrong for a long time. I watched as her expression turned from worry to sympathy, then to something closer to anger. "She's always been so self-centered," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I love her, but sometimes I don't understand why she does the things she does. You've always deserved better, Mike." Her words stung, but in the way that made me feel justified in what I was doing. I let her continue, nodding along, playing the role of the wounded husband, the man trying to keep things together despite his wife's indifference. Sarah leaned closer, her hand reaching across the table to rest on mine. "I'm sorry you're going through this," she said softly. "You're a good man, and you deserve someone who values you." Her words were sincere, and I felt a pang of regret, but I couldn't stop now. I squeezed her hand, meeting her gaze with an intensity one hoped would convey my gratitude. I told her how much I appreciated her being there, how it meant more to me than she could understand. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking, our conversations flowing easily as I laid the groundwork for the next step of my plan. I could see the faint blush in her cheeks, the way her smile grew shy when I complimented her. She was warming to me, and as the afternoon wore on, I sensed that this wouldn't be as difficult as I'd thought. When we finally said goodbye, Sarah hugged me tightly, whispering that she was always there for me. I thanked her, telling her how much I valued her support, and as I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. My plan was in motion, and with Sarah's trust, I knew it was only a matter of time before Emily's perfect world would come crashing down. But as I drove home, a part of me wondered if I was becoming just as twisted and duplicitous as the woman I was trying to punish. The days after meeting with Sarah felt surreal. The anger I carried around was like a weight in my chest, but now I had a focus, an outlet. It was strange how Sarah's warmth and kindness soothed the storm inside me, if only for brief moments. She didn't know what had happened, and maybe that was for the best. I didn't need her sympathy. I needed her to trust me, to see me as someone who had been wronged, someone she could help. Since that first coffee meetup, I'd been texting her, keeping up the persona of the bruised husband who needed support. Sarah's responses were always warm, always caring, and in every reply, I could sense her growing attachment. I felt a pang of guilt each time I opened one of her messages, but I pushed it down, letting my need for revenge drown it out. She didn't deserve to be pulled into this, but my anger at Emily had taken over, turning even my guilt into fuel. One evening, I invited her over. The invitation was casual, framed as a way for us to talk without distractions. She didn't hesitate, and that eagerness confirmed what I had suspected. Sarah's loyalty to her sister was wearing thin. Emily had always treated Sarah as an inconvenience, a younger sibling she barely tolerated. For years, Sarah had put up with Emily's dismissive attitude, her constant criticisms, and her dismissals. Now, it seemed Sarah was ready to let her loyalty falter in favor of someone who valued her. Someone like me. When Sarah arrived, I made sure everything looked relaxed. I'd set up the living room with some of her favorite drinks, even put on her favorite music. Small touches that showed I'd been paying attention over the years. She noticed and smiled, visibly touched by the effort. It felt manipulative, but I reminded myself that this was all for a purpose. Emily had shattered my life, and this was simply the cost of making things right. We settled onto the couch, and soon, our conversation shifted to the personal, the kind of intimate, vulnerable talk that builds connection. Sarah opened up about her struggles with Emily, how she'd always felt sidelined, overshadowed by her sister's confidence and ambition. Her voice shook with emotion as she shared moments I'd never known about. The cutting remarks, the instances where Emily had dismissed her, belittling her for not living up to some imaginary standard. I listened, nodding, showing her that I understood. In that moment, my anger at Emily deepened. It was almost too easy to empathize with Sarah, to see her not as my wife's sister but as someone who, like me, had been betrayed. At one point, she looked up at me, her eyes wide and filled with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "You know, Mike," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "I've always felt like you were the only one who really saw me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implications, and in that moment, I realized just how far I was willing to take this. I reached out, brushing a stray hair behind her ear, my fingers lingering against her cheek. Her breath caught, her gaze flickering between my eyes and my lips. There was no more room for hesitation. I closed the space between us, and the kiss that followed was electric, a release of the tension that had been building for days. We pulled back, both of us slightly breathless, and I could see the confusion and excitement in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she stammered, but I shook my head, silencing her doubts with a reassuring smile. "No, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "You have nothing to apologize for. I should be thanking you. You've been here for me when I needed someone the most." Her shoulders relaxed, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. I knew then that I had her trust, her loyalty. Emily's perfect world, her image of herself as untouchable, would soon be shattered. She'd never expected her sister to be the weapon that would bring her down, and that knowledge gave me a dark satisfaction. After that night, things with Sarah escalated. She became a regular presence in my life, her texts more frequent, her tone more familiar and intimate. She was hooked, and for her, it must have felt like a forbidden thrill, something she could cling to in defiance of the way her sister had treated her. Each time I saw her, each time she leaned closer, I knew that my plan was working. Emily, on the other hand, had been blowing up my phone with messages and calls, all of which I ignored. The silence seemed to bother her more than any confrontation would have. She'd called from different numbers, trying to get me to pick up, each voicemail pleading, bargaining, telling me I was overreacting and that we could work things out. She had no idea what was coming, no idea that the tables were about to turn in the most devastating way possible. Then, a few weeks later, the opportunity for the final blow presented itself. Sarah had called, sounding excited. She was planning to come over, wanting to spend time together. I knew it was time to take this to the next level, to do something that Emily would never recover from. The day Sarah came over, I made sure the house was quiet, the atmosphere intimate. She looked beautiful, her excitement barely contained, and I could see the trust in her eyes, the belief that this was something real. We spent hours together, talking, laughing, sharing parts of ourselves we hadn't before. And then, as the evening crept in, we crossed a line I knew we could never come back from. The guilt was there, pressing down on me, but I pushed it aside. I had to focus on the goal. As we lay there afterward, Sarah's head resting on my shoulder, a thought occurred to me. What if Emily found out right now, while she was still convinced that she could win me back? What if she walked in on us, saw the final proof that I had moved on, that I'd found comfort in the last place she'd expect? Almost as if fate had aligned with my plan, I heard a car pulling into the driveway. I recognized the sound. It was Emily's. Apparently, she decided that ignoring her calls and messages wasn't enough, that she needed to confront me in person. I barely had a moment to think, to react, before I heard her footsteps approaching the door. "Mike? I know you're here, please, we need to talk." Emily's voice called from downstairs. Panic flitted across Sarah's face, but I took her hand, squeezing it gently. "It's okay," I whispered, a calmness in my voice that I didn't entirely feel. "Just stay here. I'll handle it." I grabbed a robe, stepping out into the hallway and closing the door behind me. As I reached the top of the stairs, Emily was already making her way up, her eyes lighting up with hope as she saw me. "Mike, I know things have been bad, but please let's talk. I know you're hurting, but we can fix this. We just need to—" "Stop," I said, my tone cutting her off. "There's nothing left to fix, Emily." She froze, the smile fading from her face as she registered my words. "What do you mean?" I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I watched her expression change from hopeful to hurt to confused. "I mean, it's over. You made your choices, and now I've made mine." I watched as realization dawned on her, her gaze shifting to the closed door of the bedroom, the one she knew held her sister. "No, Mike, you wouldn't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Wouldn't I?" I shot back, my voice cold. "You think you're the only one who can play these games, Emily? You think I'm just going to sit here, humiliated and waiting for you to come back whenever it suits you?" She looked stunned, as though she hadn't truly believed I could ever hurt her. "How could you?" "Sarah, she's my sister." "You knew?" "Yes, I knew," I interrupted, my voice a low hiss. "And now you know what it feels like to lose everything, just like you took everything from me. You wanted, well, I found someone who made me feel whole again." The look on her face was one I'd never forget. There was no defiance now, no sense of superiority, just a raw, broken vulnerability that was as satisfying as it was tragic. She turned, eyes filled with shock and betrayal, and stumbled down the stairs. I followed her, watching as she fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking, her breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "Get out of my house, Emily," I said, my voice steady. "And don't come back." She didn't respond, just cast one last, shattered look back at me before she slipped out the door and into the night. I stood there, my heart pounding with a mix of triumph and emptiness. The revenge had been served, but as the adrenaline faded, a cold emptiness crept in. I knew I had just burned every bridge, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The satisfaction was there, but so was something darker, a regret that I wasn't ready to confront. I had achieved my revenge, but as I stood alone in the silence of the house, I wondered if the victory was worth the cost. As the door closed behind Emily, a silence filled the house that felt almost suffocating. I stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving a hollow emptiness in its wake. For weeks, I'd imagined this moment, replaying it over and over in my head, thinking it would bring me a twisted sense of satisfaction, a catharsis to numb the pain she'd caused. And yet, as I stood there alone, I felt anything but triumphant. Instead, there was a heavy, unsettling feeling of regret, creeping up on me like a shadow I couldn't escape. Sarah was still upstairs, blissfully unaware of the confrontation that had just happened on the other side of the bedroom door. A part of me wanted to leave her there, to delay the truth just a little longer, to let her believe this was something beautiful and real. But I knew that was a lie. What we'd shared was built on anger and revenge, not love, and dragging her deeper into it would only lead to more pain. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to confront the reality of what I'd done. Sarah was innocent in all of this, but I'd used her, manipulated her emotions in a way that was cold, calculated, and cruel. She trusted me, looked up to me, and I'd twisted that trust to hurt someone else. Emily's betrayal had cut me deeply, but was this really the man I wanted to become? Was hurting someone else going to heal the wounds she'd inflicted? Slowly, I climbed the stairs, my heart heavy with the knowledge that what I was about to do would shatter whatever illusions Sarah had of me. When I opened the door, she was still lying there, a soft smile on her face as she looked up at me, her eyes warm and full of a trust one no longer deserved. "Hey," she whispered, her voice soft and inviting. "Did everything go okay with Emily?" I hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt twist in my chest. I forced myself to meet her gaze, to hold her hand one last time before I let it all go. "Sarah, there's something we need to talk about," I began, my voice barely steady. She frowned, propping herself up on her elbows, a hint of worry flickering in her eyes. "What's wrong?" For a moment, I couldn't find the words. I'd never been good at admitting my own mistakes, let alone one as severe as this. But I knew she deserved the truth, however ugly it was. All of this, I gestured between us, "it wasn't fair to you. I've been using you, Sarah." Her face fell, confusion giving way to hurt as my words sank in. "Using me?" she echoed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What are you talking about?" I forced myself to keep going, even as every word felt like a betrayal. When I found out about Emily and what she did with my stepfather, it broke me. I was angry. I wanted to hurt her the way she'd hurt me, and I thought that if I turned to you, if I made her feel betrayed by her own family, it would give me some kind of justice. The color drained from Sarah's face as my confession sank in, her gaze hardening with a pain I'd never wanted to inflict on her. "So it was all just to get back at her?" she asked, her voice cracking as she looked away, disbelief mingling with devastation in her eyes. "Sarah, please, it's not as simple as that." I reached out, but she pulled back, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and heartbreak that twisted in my gut. "It seems pretty simple to me," she snapped, her voice trembling. "You used me. You lied to me. And here I was, thinking that maybe I could actually trust someone." Her words hit me like a slap, each one more painful than the last. I'd always seen myself as the victim, as the one who'd been wronged. But looking at Sarah now, I realized I'd become the very thing I hated. I was no better than Emily or Robert. I'd hurt someone who had done nothing but care about me, someone who had believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. "Sarah, I'm sorry," I whispered, but even as I said the words, I knew they were hollow. There was no apology that could undo what I'd done, no explanation that could justify the way I treated her. She stood up, pulling on her clothes in hurried, jerky movements, her hands shaking with the rage she was struggling to contain. "You're just as bad as she is. You know that," she spat, her voice raw with anger and betrayal. Maybe even worse. At least she didn't pretend to care. I felt a fresh wave of shame wash over me, but I didn't try to stop her. She was right. I didn't deserve her forgiveness or her understanding. I'd betrayed her, twisted her trust, and there was no going back from that. Without another word, she stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing through the silent house. I followed her to the door, watching as she walked down the driveway, her shoulders tense, her posture rigid with anger and heartbreak. When she reached her car, she looked back one last time, her eyes filled with a hurt I'd never seen before. Then she got in, slamming the door and driving away without a second glance. As her taillights disappeared into the night, I stood there, alone, realizing the full weight of what I'd done. I'd lost everything, my wife, my stepfather, and now, the one person who had tried to be there for me. And all because I'd let my need for revenge consume me, turning me into someone I didn't even recognize. The days that followed were bleak, a haze of regret and self-loathing. I kept to myself, avoiding calls from friends and family, ignoring the few messages Emily had dared to send, each one more desperate than the last. I'd thought that ruining her relationship with her sister would bring me satisfaction, but instead, it had left me feeling hollow, a twisted sense of emptiness that gnawed at me every waking moment. One evening, as I sat in the quiet darkness of my living room, The weight of it all crashed down on me. I realized then that revenge, as sweet as it had seemed in the beginning, had only left a deeper wound. By trying to hurt Emily, I'd ended up hurting myself in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd allowed my anger to turn me into someone bitter and vindictive, someone I didn't want to be. With a heavy heart, I decided that it was time to confront the damage I'd done. I needed to make amends, however impossible that seemed, even if only for my own conscience. I'd have to face Emily, not out of some misplaced hope for reconciliation, but to put an end to the cycle of betrayal and lies that had consumed us both. When I finally dialed her number, the phone rang for a long time before she answered. Her voice was soft, tentative, as if she didn't dare believe I was reaching out. Mike? I didn't think you'd ever call. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. We need to talk, Emily. Face to face. She hesitated, and I could almost hear the emotions warring inside her. All right, she finally agreed, her voice barely a whisper. When? Tomorrow, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Come to the house. We'll talk, and then we can finally put all of this behind us. The next day felt like a funeral, each hour dragging by with the weight of what lay ahead. When Emily finally arrived, the look on her face was one of wary anticipation, a mix of relief and fear. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting to see evidence of what I'd done with her sister. But there was nothing left, just the two of us, surrounded by the wreckage of our broken marriage. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing where to begin. Finally, I cleared my throat, forcing myself to meet her gaze. I don't think there's anything left to save between us, I said, my voice low but firm. We both made choices that can't be undone, things that have ruined whatever we had. But I need you to know that I take responsibility for my part in this. I wanted to hurt you, and I went too far. Her face softened, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. I hurt you first, Mike. I betrayed you in the worst way. You didn't deserve that, and I'll never forgive myself for what I did. For the first time, I believed her. The regret in her eyes was raw, genuine, and in that moment, I realized that this was the closure I needed. Not revenge, not anger, but an understanding of our shared failures. We're done, Emily, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I think we both need to let go of the anger, the need to hurt each other. It's only going to destroy us. She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I'm sorry, Mike, for everything. And with that, we said our goodbyes, each of us walking away from the ruin of what we'd once shared. I watched her leave, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. It was over. The cycle of betrayal, anger, and revenge had finally ended, leaving only the scars as a reminder of what we'd lost. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of peace. After Emily left, the silence in the house settled like a heavy fog. I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, the reality of everything finally sinking in. It was strange how quickly things had unraveled, how a single act of betrayal had led to such destruction. My life was unrecognizable, shattered by choices that I now wished I could take back. The anger, the rage, and the need for revenge that had driven me felt empty, and I wondered if I had really accomplished anything besides adding more pain to an already broken situation. Over the next few days, I forced myself to confront the mess I'd created. I went back to work, burying myself in projects and meetings, hoping the routine would help dull the ache of regret. But everywhere I turned, reminders of what had happened haunted me. Colleagues who knew about my marriage asked after Emily, and each time, I struggled to find an answer that didn't unravel into painful memories. Friends reached out, sensing something was wrong, but I wasn't ready to talk. It was hard to admit that I had turned into someone I barely recognized, someone consumed by bitterness. Then there was Sarah. She hadn't reached out since the night she left, and I didn't blame her. I'd manipulated her, twisted her genuine kindness into a weapon, and hurt her in a way she never deserved. I knew I should apologize, but the thought of facing her again, of trying to explain my actions, felt impossible. Yet, I knew it was something I had to do if I was ever going to find any sense of peace. I owed her that much. A week passed before I finally worked up the courage to call her. My heart raced as the phone rang, and for a moment, I hoped she wouldn't answer. But then, her voice came through, sharp and guarded. Mike. She sounded surprised, her tone colder than I'd ever heard. Hey, Sarah. I wanted to talk, if you're willing to listen. I struggled to keep my voice steady, feeling a wave of nerves wash over me. There was a long pause, and I could almost hear her debating whether or not to give me the time of day. Finally, she sighed. All right, Mike. But I don't know what you could possibly say to make any of this right. I don't expect forgiveness, I said quickly, not wanting her to misunderstand. I want to apologize. I used you, Sarah, and I know I hurt you in the process. It was wrong, and you didn't deserve any of it. She was silent on the other end, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then, she spoke, her voice tinged with hurt. You know, Mike, I always thought you were different. I thought you were better than my sister, better than the games and the lies. But I guess I was wrong about both of you. Her words stung, but I knew I deserved them. You weren't wrong about me, not completely. I made a mistake, a huge one, but I don't want you to think that everything we shared was a lie. I did care about you, Sarah. I still do. And I'm sorry that I let my anger and hurt turn me into someone I'm not proud of. Another silence fell between us, and I could tell she was trying to process everything I'd said. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. I don't know if I can forgive you, Mike. What you did, it broke something in me. I looked up to you. I trusted you. I understand, I replied softly, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, less cold. I appreciate the apology, Mike, but I think it's best if we both move on from this. We both need time to heal, and I don't think staying in each other's lives is going to help. Her words hit me harder than I'd expected, but I knew she was right. The damage was done, and no amount of apologies could change what had happened. I understand. I just want you to know that I'm here if you ever need anything. Goodbye, Mike, she said quietly, and before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there for a long time, holding the phone in my hand, feeling the weight of her goodbye settle over me. I'd known this moment was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. Sarah had been a bright spot in a dark time, and now, even that small comfort was gone. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding my life, piece by piece. I moved out of the house, finding an apartment in the city where I could start fresh. The house held too many memories, too much pain, and I knew I needed a clean break. Leaving it behind was harder than I'd anticipated, but as I locked the door for the last time, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I were shedding the weight of the past. Work became my refuge, the one place where I could focus on something productive, something that didn't remind me of the mistakes I'd made. I started staying late, taking on extra projects, anything to keep my mind occupied. The long hours numbed the pain, giving me a sense of purpose that had been missing since my world had fallen apart. But even as I tried to move forward, I couldn't escape the consequences of my actions. Friends drifted away, sensing the bitterness and anger that still lingered beneath the surface. I wasn't the same person they'd known, and I couldn't blame them for keeping their distance. I'd changed, hardened by the betrayals and regrets that now defined me. Then one day, as I was heading out of the office, I ran into someone I hadn't expected to see, Robert, my stepfather. He was waiting in the lobby, his expression unreadable, and as our eyes met, a flood of anger and resentment surged through me. I wanted nothing more than to turn around and leave, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. So, I forced myself to walk over, keeping my face impassive. Mike, he greeted me, his tone wary, as if he wasn't sure how I'd react. Robert, I replied, my voice cold. What do you want? He sighed, glancing around before looking back at me. I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to, but I felt like I owed you an explanation. What happened with Emily? It was a mistake, one I regret deeply. A bitter laugh escaped me. A mistake? That's an understatement, don't you think? He flinched, but he held his ground. I know I hurt you, Mike, and nothing I say can change that. but I want you to know that I never intended to betray you. Emily and I, it just happened, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I lost sight of what mattered. I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. What mattered? Family, Robert? Loyalty? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you threw all of that away. He nodded, his expression pained. You're right. I did. And I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, for whatever it's worth. For a long moment, I said nothing, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. But as I looked at him, the man who had once been a father figure to me, I felt a strange sense of pity. He looked older, wearier, as if the weight of his choices had taken a toll on him too. I can't forgive you, I said quietly, my voice steady, but I can let go of the anger. Holding on to it, it's only tearing me apart. He nodded, relief flashing briefly in his eyes. Thank you, Mike. That's more than I deserve. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the lobby. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of closure, a faint sense of peace that I hadn't felt in months. I'd made mistakes, I'd been betrayed, and I'd lost people I cared about. But as I left the building, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move forward. The weeks that followed were slow, each day bringing small moments of clarity, of healing. I found myself reflecting on the past, on the choices I'd made and the person I'd become. The need for revenge, the anger that had consumed me. It all felt so distant now, like a bad dream I was finally waking up from. I began to reconnect with old friends, reaching out to people I'd pushed away in my bitterness. I started therapy, working through the pain and regret that had weighed on me for so long. It was a long road, and there were days when the grief felt unbearable, but slowly, I began to see glimpses of hope. One day, as I was leaving my therapist's office, I got a text from an old friend inviting me to a dinner party. It was a simple invitation, one that I would have ignored in the past, but this time, I decided to go. I needed to start saying yes to life again, to find joy in small moments. At the dinner, I met people who knew nothing of my past, who saw me not as the man who'd been betrayed or the one seeking revenge, but as someone new, someone with a future. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. As I looked around the room, laughing with strangers and feeling the warmth of their company, I realized that my life wasn't over. I had the power to start fresh, to rebuild, to become someone I could be proud of. The road ahead was uncertain, but as I left the party that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of hope. The dinner party was a turning point, a glimpse into a life where I wasn't defined by anger or betrayal. For the first time, I saw a way forward, and that realization stayed with me, guiding me through the days that followed. The conversations I'd had that night reminded me of the person I once was, confident, easygoing, even optimistic. It was a welcome reprieve from the bitterness that had consumed me for so long. Still, moving forward wasn't easy. The memories of Emily, of everything that had happened, lingered, casting shadows over my progress. There were days when I'd catch myself thinking of her, of the life we'd planned together, and the weight of regret would settle over me like a dark cloud. But each time that happened, I reminded myself that I was no longer that man, that I was rebuilding, piece by piece, into someone new. Therapy had become a part of my routine, a place where I could unravel the tangled emotions that still lingered. My therapist, Dr. Green, was patient, guiding me through the layers of resentment, guilt, and self-doubt that I'd buried beneath the anger. She helped me see that the pain I felt wasn't just about Emily and Robert's betrayal. It was also about my own choices, my own need for revenge, and the damage I'd inflicted in the process. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Dr. Green looked at me thoughtfully, her pen tapping against her notepad. You know, Mike, you're carrying a lot of guilt. And from what you've told me, it seems like you've taken steps to make amends. But have you forgiven yourself? The question caught me off guard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. Forgive myself? The thought seemed foreign, even absurd. I'd made mistakes, hurt people who didn't deserve it, people like Sarah. The idea of forgiving myself felt almost indulgent. I don't know if I can do that, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. I feel like I should carry this guilt. I deserve it. Dr. Green leaned forward, her expression compassionate but firm. Guilt can be a useful emotion, Mike, but only if it leads to change. Holding on to it forever? That's a punishment, not a lesson. You've taken responsibility. You've done what you can to make amends. Forgiveness isn't about letting yourself off the hook. It's about freeing yourself to move forward. Her words stayed with me long after the session ended, echoing in my mind as I drove home. Forgiveness, it was something I hadn't considered. I'd been so focused on the wrongs others had done to me, on the hurt I'd caused in return, that I'd never stopped to think about what it would mean to let go. A few days later, I decided to take another step toward healing. I reached out to my brother, Tom, who had been a steady presence in my life before everything fell apart. He'd been there when I needed him most, but I'd pulled away, embarrassed and ashamed of how consumed I'd become with revenge. I'd missed him, missed our easy conversations, and I realized it was time to reconnect. We met at a quiet bar on a Friday night, and as soon as I walked in, Tom waved me over, a grin spreading across his face. "Mike, been a while, man. You're looking different." "Good, he said, patting me on the back as I took a seat. "Thanks," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I guess I'm trying to put everything behind me, you know?" Tom nodded, his expression softening. "I'm glad to hear that. You went through hell, Mike, and honestly, we were all worried about you. But I can see you're doing better." We talked for hours, catching up on everything I'd missed while I'd been wrapped up in my anger and pain. He told me about his new job, his recent hiking trips, and plans he had for the future. And as we sat there, laughing and sharing stories, I felt something lift, a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. After that night, I made it a point to reconnect with others I'd lost touch with. Old friends, colleagues, even family members who had kept their distance while I'd been at my worst. Some were hesitant, their trust in me shaken by the anger that had consumed me. But most were willing to give me a second chance, and little by little, I rebuilt those bridges, creating a new foundation for the life I was trying to build. Then, one day, as I was cleaning out the last of my things from storage, I stumbled across a box filled with old photos and mementos from my time with Emily. Part of me wanted to throw it all away, to erase every trace of her from my life. But as I sifted through the photos, the memories flooded back. Not just the painful ones, but also the moments of happiness, of laughter and love that we'd shared before everything went wrong. I sat down, holding a photo of us from our honeymoon, both of us smiling, carefree, oblivious to the pain that lay ahead. For the first time, I allowed myself to remember the good, to acknowledge that what we'd had hadn't been all lies or deceit. There had been love there, real love, and I'd cherished her once. I trusted her, shared my life with her. And though it had ended in betrayal, that didn't erase the fact that, for a time, she'd been a part of my world. It was a strange feeling, to look at those photos and feel something other than anger. I felt a sadness, a sense of loss, but also a quiet acceptance. Emily had hurt me, yes, but she was human, flawed, just like me. She'd made mistakes, just as I had. And in that moment, I realized that holding on to the bitterness was only hurting me, keeping me tied to a past that no longer had power over me. I packed up the photos, placing them back in the box, but instead of tossing it out, I stored it away in a closet. I wasn't ready to completely let go of those memories, but I no longer needed them to define me. As the months went on, life started to take on a new rhythm. I joined a local hiking group, finding peace in the quiet beauty of nature, in the steady, grounding feeling of being outside. I started painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned years ago, and the simple act of creating something with my hands became a source of joy, a reminder that I was capable of more than anger and pain. One evening, after a long day of work, I decided to check my messages. I hadn't been keeping up with social media, preferring to focus on the real connections in my life, but I noticed a message from Sarah. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, surprised to see her name after all these months. "Hi, Mike. I just wanted to reach out and see how you've been. I hope things are getting better." "I'm doing well, by the way. just got a promotion, and finally moved into my own place. Anyway, I just wanted to let you know I've forgiven you. I know it took me a while, but I see now that we both made mistakes. I hope you're doing okay." I read the message several times, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. Her forgiveness was something I hadn't expected, something I hadn't dared hope for. I'd made peace with the idea that I might never hear from her again, but knowing that she had found it in herself to let go brought me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. I replied, keeping it simple, "Thank you, Sarah. I'm so glad to hear you're doing well. I'm sorry for everything, and I wish you nothing but happiness. Take care." As I hit send, a weight lifted from my shoulders. Her message was a reminder that healing was possible, that forgiveness, both for myself and for others, was within reach. I had spent so long punishing myself, letting guilt and regret dictate my every move. But now, with her forgiveness, I felt like I could finally let go. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. My life was different now, quieter, more grounded, and I realized that I no longer felt the need for revenge or retribution. I had learned to find peace within myself, to let go of the past and embrace the possibility of a future I could be proud of. One evening, as I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. It wasn't the loud, passionate kind of happiness I'd once chased. It was quieter, more enduring, a steady warmth that I knew would stay with me. The road to this moment had been long, filled with mistakes, pain, and regret. But I'd made it through, emerging on the other side as someone I could respect, someone who had faced his demons and come out stronger. And as I stood there, watching the city lights flicker to life, I knew that I was finally ready to let go of the past, to step into a new chapter with an open heart and a clear mind. The journey had been hard, but it had led me to a place of peace, a place where I could, at last, move forward. The start of the new year came quietly, marked not by grand celebrations, but by a quiet resolve that settled over me. I'd spent so much of the last year grappling with anger, betrayal, and regret, but now, standing at the beginning of a new chapter, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. The anger that had once fueled me had burned away, leaving only the ashes of what had been. From those ashes, I was ready to rebuild. In the weeks that followed, I focused on putting the final touches on my new life. I committed to routines that centered me, my hiking group, my painting, reconnecting with friends and family. I poured myself into work, taking on a few projects that challenged me and gave me a new sense of purpose. There was something freeing about losing myself in the rhythm of these routines, in knowing that I was moving forward rather than looking back. One evening, as I was leaving the office, my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but I answered out of habit. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a hesitant voice on the other end. "Mike? It's Emily." Hearing her voice was jarring, like a ghost from a life I had almost forgotten. My heart twisted with a mixture of emotions I thought I'd put to rest, but I took a steadying breath, keeping my voice calm. "Emily, I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I know," she replied softly, a hint of nervousness in her tone. I just wanted to reach out. I heard from Sarah that you've been doing well, and I guess I wanted to say I'm glad. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us, about everything." I listened in silence, unsure of what to say. There was a part of me that wanted to ask her why she was reaching out now, after all this time, but I reminded myself that I no longer needed answers from her. I'd made my peace with the past, with her, and with the choices that had brought me here. "I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness or anything," she continued, her voice faltering slightly. "I just wanted to let you know that I'm sorry. For everything. I don't think I ever realized how much I hurt you, how much damage I did, until I saw what I'd lost. I wanted you to know that I'll always regret it." Her words, though unexpected, held a sincerity that surprised me. I'd spent months hating her, resenting her for the pain she'd caused, but now, hearing her voice, I realized that the anger was gone. All that remained was a quiet acceptance of what had happened, a feeling of closure I hadn't known I needed. "Thank you, Emily," I said finally, my voice calm. "I appreciate you saying that. I've moved on, and I hope you find happiness too. We both made mistakes, and we've both had to live with the consequences. But I think it's time for both of us to let go." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear her processing my words. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and filled with a relief that matched my own. "You're right. Thank you, Mike. I wish you nothing but the best." With that, we said our goodbyes, and I ended the call feeling lighter, as if a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. It was strange, but in that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. A final chapter closed, a new beginning in sight. In the months that followed, I continued to carve out a life that felt genuinely mine. I went on trips with my hiking group, discovering parts of the world I'd never seen. Each new landscape a reminder of the beauty life had to offer. I even started sharing my paintings with others, joining a local art group where I found support and inspiration in ways I hadn't expected. One day, at a gallery event hosted by the art group, I met a woman named Claire. She was kind, with a warm smile and a quiet confidence that drew me in. Our conversations flowed easily, and I found myself laughing in a way I hadn't in a long time. There was no pretense, no expectations, just two people enjoying each other's company. Over the next few weeks, we continued to see each other, sharing dinners, hikes, and quiet evenings. Claire understood my past, my mistakes, and she accepted me for who I was. With her, there was no need to hide, no need to pretend I was someone I wasn't. She became a part of my healing, a reminder that life could still hold joy, even after everything I'd been through. On a warm summer evening, as Claire and I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sunset over the city, I realized just how far I'd come. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her presence a steady, comforting warmth that felt like home. "You seem happy," she murmured, her voice soft. "Content." I nodded, feeling a smile spread across my face. "I think I finally am." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, I felt a sense of gratitude wash over me. The journey to this moment had been long and painful, filled with mistakes and regrets, but I'd made it through. I'd faced my demons, forgiven myself, and found a way to move forward. For the first time in a long time, I was at peace. Not because I'd forgotten the past, but because I'd learned to live with it, to let it be a part of my story without defining me. The anger, the need for revenge, the bitterness, they were gone, replaced by a quiet resilience, a strength I hadn't known I was capable of. As I sat there, the city lights twinkling below, I realized that life wasn't about avoiding pain or betrayal. It was about finding the courage to face it, to learn from it, and to rebuild in the aftermath. I'd found my way back to myself, and though the scars remained, they no longer hurt. They were simply reminders of a journey I'd survived, a testament to the strength I'd found within. With Claire by my side and a future filled with possibility, I knew that I was finally free. The path ahead was unknown, but I was ready to embrace it, to move forward with an open heart and a clear mind. And for the first time in my life, I felt whole. Oh my God, another really good one. I really hope you enjoyed this Reddit story video. I had a great time reading this. If you want more of this kind of content, just leave a comment, let me know. Follow my channel. I'm really trying to hit 1,000 subs before the end of the year. And we can do it. It's going to happen, guys. Thank you so much. Now, everybody have a great night and have a sweet dreams.